Without further ado, I will simply present what I've prepared for today, which I think will resonate with people who are in my class on different levels with what we are doing there, but hopefully it will also make some sense for those who are not in the class, in the seminar. So idea is basically to start out of two things that are quite of actuality today, that we kind of are batting in all the time, the question of feelings and the question of also enjoyment. I mean, the title of the lecture, as you probably know, is To Enjoy is to Trespass, and then hopefully to try to work or show how these seemingly simply psychological issues can open up or should open up also a serious kind of political debate, perhaps, at least kind of indicate this. Okay, so I will simply start with rather, I think, obvious claim for those at least who come from the kind of background that I come from, the let's say, Lacanian background, that what is usually referred to in Lacan by symbolic order and all its structures, that this is not simply a kind of a tool with which we humans approach some real outside it. It's not simply a medium through which and only through which we see and understand the reality, but symbolic structures, also language as part of these structures, are actually part of the reality to begin with. So they don't come from within us, they are already out there. It is a reality that invades us, actually, that kind of intrudes into us, makes us not only speak, obviously, but also feel. And I will dwell on this last point a little bit. I mean, I apologize for making some rather obvious statements, but I think sometimes it is important to remind oneself of them. For instance, is it at all possible to hurt one's feelings with something else than speech, including, of course, various forms of silent treatment or some kind of a failure of communication, but nevertheless something that does belong to the symbolic register. So to put it very bluntly, if I fall, I can hurt my leg and I feel the pain, but this is different from hurting my feelings, which would happen, for example, if a person next to me were to say, "You clumsy bitch," when I fall. So hurting someone's feelings is an interesting phenomenon. Is symbolically induced pain any less real than physical pain? Or is not every pain somehow physical or real, even if it is symbolically induced? But we could also turn this around, perhaps, and consider the possibility opened up, for instance, with the advance of neuroscience, to make us feel pain, for instance, in the leg, by directly stimulating the brain. So this seems to kind of circumvent all symbolic means. So it must be like physical pain, but still it doesn't seem completely correct to say that my leg hurts or something like this. So, or another interesting question, could these experimenters hurt my feelings with a direct stimulation of my brain? Could they make me feel as if somebody just insulted me by a direct stimulation of my brain? So if it all translates into chemistry and chemical processes, it should become somehow possible. So in a sense, there is no great mystery in that a direct stimulation of the central nervous system has effects on what we feel. The mystery is still, I think, elsewhere. How is it possible that a mere word can produce a chemical reaction in my body or brain? So I'm sure there are lots of explanations of this, but I'm also almost sure that they cannot fully cover, let's say, this gap or leap involved in the fact that somewhere along the chain of reactions, a non-chemical element or cause leaps over to a chemical element. And here, I just use this as a pretext because I think it leads directly to a very interesting and important claim that Lacan says, something that Lacan says about the very notion of the cause, namely this rather famous Il n'y a de cause que de ce qui cloche. There is but the cause of that which does not work somehow or completely function, which does not add up. Of course, this is particular also for psychoanalysis because in it the question of the cause usually arises precisely when something interrupts, let's say, the smooth continuity of events. And of course, here the examples range from the most innocent slips of the tongue to all kinds of ways in which different symptoms betray points of significant discontinuity. So this kind of, as Jacqueline Miner put it, this puts the psychoanalytic use of the notion of the cause outside its usual connection simply to lawfulness and regularity. The question of the cause appears precisely when a causal chain kind of breaks up, which is to say that what is crucial for the concept of cause in psychoanalysis is the element of discontinuity, precisely. Okay, this is a valuable and important lesson, yet a lesson that I think still needs to be properly argued. For the following objection might be raised immediately. Is the question of the cause in psychoanalysis not always the question of another hidden cause, which can well be part of some other regularity than the one that has been interrupted, say by the slip of the tongue, yet which nevertheless follows its own unyielding necessity and regularity? And has not psychoanalysis always tended to recognize precisely in these seemingly accidental slips affirm logic and regularity? Of course, this is true. And the discontinuity in itself is certainly no immediate proof of the absence of causality. What it proves or bears witness to is something else, namely the fact that between the two levels that, for instance, psychoanalytic interpretation deals with, like the manifest and the latent level, to use the Freudian terms, there is no smooth, immediate passage, just as there is no fixed key that could provide the translation simply from one level into the other. Just to use a very to-the-point quote here by Mladen, Dolar, in relationship to this, the reconstruction, this is the quote, the reconstruction of the latent text behind the strata of distortion is far from presenting us with the unconscious in persona. On the contrary, we are on the track of the unconscious only in the space between the two, in the irreducible interval between the manifest and the latent, in the surplus of distortion over the true content, in the dream work that produced the distortion. End of quote. So you see roughly what I'm getting at. In principle, the distortion as a form of discontinuity can be explained, related to its causes, yet besides the unconscious causes of distortion, there is also something else at work here, something that we can call perhaps the unconscious as the cause of the distortion, as the surplus of the distortion over true content, a cause kind of motivated by itself. Yet as such, as this kind of a strange causa sui, the cause only exists in the very relationship between the two levels, and not kind of independently of them. In short, we are dealing with a cause that is linked to the existence of the two levels and to this constitutive gap or interspace between them, yet which is not directly determined or deducible from or reducible to either of them. It only exists as the articulation of their non-relationship, also we could say, something that they do not come together. So, il n'y a de cause que de ce qui cloche. There is but the cause of that which does not work. And I will now read you a brief quote from Lacan, which is very picturesque and I think which kind of brings in or illustrates what he means here by cause in a quite funny and amusing even way. He says, cause is to be distinguished from that which is determinate in a chain, in other words, from the law. By way of example, think of what is pictured in the law of action and reaction. There is here, one might say, a single principle. One does not go without the other. The mass of a body that is crushed on the ground is not the cause of that which it receives in return for its vital force. Its mass is integrated in this force that comes back to it in order to dissolve its coherence by return effect. There is no gap here, except perhaps at the end, that is to say, in the ground. Whenever we speak of cause, on the other hand, there is always something anti-conceptual, something indefinite. The phases of the moon are the cause of tides. We know that the word cause is correctly used here. Or again, miasmas are the cause of fever. That doesn't mean anything either. There is a whole and something that oscillates in the interval. Okay, I think it is a kind of a picturesque way of presenting how he distinguishes between this kind of uninterrupted or unproblematic one thing passing into the other, and another situation when we legitimately speak or use the word cause.
Where's this from?
This is from Seminar 11. Yeah, sorry. So, okay, this sentence also then brings us to another important idea involved in Lacan's account of causality, namely this something that oscillates, that appears in the whole and oscillates there, in this interval or gap, in this kind of structural split of causality, is precisely that for which psychoanalysis actually reserves this name of the cause, like the cause of desire. This object TA is something that Lacan situates or recognizes precisely in this split. But I won't go into this now. So just to now perhaps a little bit forcefully, but nevertheless linked to this, to the beginning of my talk, we could say that this is precisely why it is appropriate to say her remark caused me a lot of pain and his grip hurt my hand. If I said his grip caused me a lot of pain, this already, I think, would suggest that the grip also hurt my feelings, and there was this kind of symbolic gap in between. Or perhaps then we could also say, if our feelings hurt, there is a cause. But this does not mean simply justification. It does not simply mean that if my feelings are hurt, someone is guilty of offense, although this is indeed how sometimes, and I think with increasing frequency, things get articulated today. Feelings are often taken as kind of an ultimate criterion of there being or not an, let's say, offense committed and has to be sanctioned. And this is problematic in itself. But the problem is not simply that feelings are unreliable or as well as indiscriminate in themselves. For instance, someone who just, I don't know, hates women usually has very strong feelings about them, but what exactly do these feelings testify to? What is the real that they are pointing at? Probably not that women are mean or something like this. So there is a certain problem to rely on this. But this is not the problem that I want to discuss today. The problem is more like that hurt feelings bring in precisely the issue of causality, that is to say, of the interspace of the interval it implies, that causality implies. Everything happens, or a lot of things happen in this interspace, which is precisely not fully covered. Not only it is not fully covered like in advance by physical or chemical connections, it is also not fully covered in advance by the symbolic and the symbolic connections. This is to say that it is impossible to establish a direct link between words and their effects. The same word can have very different effects. It can indeed hurt someone and not someone else, but it's the question of the same word, or circumstances, of course. So what takes place in this interspace is work, precisely. Sometimes a lot of work, and the result of it is, or not, or there is some kind of causal connection. but work in relation to what? Precisely in relation to what Lacan calls this objet A, this object that kind of appears in the interval. So perhaps another and a rather strong, but nevertheless way of putting this would be to say that on some level I always get to decide whether my feelings will really hurt or not, be hurt or not. Of course, not necessarily in any kind of straightforward, conscious way, but still, some kind of decision regarding this seems to take place. And this does not mean that if I decide that they do hurt, then this is simply make it my problem and my responsibility, absolving the other from his or hers. This is not what I'm saying. But it only means that we are never just simply passive receivers or of symbolic or even physical blows, and this is precisely why some of these blows can hurt so much. This is not something that is there in order to kind of diminish their relevance or pain. So, but what is this interspace? It is not simply symbolic, it is not simply real, it is not regulated really in the sense of some kind of a palpable reality. It is not regulated in advance by physical or symbolic laws. It has to be somehow negotiated, worked through, and it gets decided in view of course, different concrete circumstances or configurations. I think also that this is a kind of a very crucial empty space which is at work in all social interaction, out of which many of our social ties and configurations are actually generated, and in which they're actually decided, through which they become what they are. We may think that things as they are already like by some kind of a eternal and inherent necessity, but actually it is very much at this point that what has always already been there is decided. Which is why I think it is also important that this interspace is there. Undoubtedly, this is also the space of frictions and conflicts. But the attempts to kind of eliminate this interspace in advance, this kind of preemptive regulation of it, in order to precisely avoid certain frictions and conflicts, is, I think, itself a very doubtful strategy. It is the strategy, for instance, employed or at work in some, at least some of the ways in which, we are all kind of bashing this notion, political correctness is functioning, precisely when it is about an attempt to kind of preemptively transform this gap of the cause into some quasi-regularity, which functions like this in a necessary way. When we are dealing precisely with this kind of a bureaucratic attempt to fill up this interspace very often with an ever denser network of regulations and restrictions imposed, on our speech or behavior and so on. But as we can also notice, more often than not, the effect of this is not simply a pacification of this interspace. Sometimes it is. I'm not saying that this never works. I think it definitely does sometimes, and it is a good intervention. But very often, and I think more and more so, we see this kind of this not pacification, but rather like a growing expansion of this very interspace, because the regulation itself becomes intrinsic to it and kind of gets subjected to its indefinite logic. We see this in the way in which certain, for instance, politically correct names and forms get immediately infected, so to say, with suspicion and kind of improper, twisted connotation, and need to be replaced by others and so on. And the other effect of this approach, I think, is also a kind of shrinking of the proper space of subjectivity, for the latter tends to be reduced precisely to a kind of receptacle of feelings, whereas the means and ways of negotiate them are delegated, are kind of outsourced to these protective rules. there is certainly also a kind of infantilizing move at work here. We should kind of be equipped to handle, to decide certain situations and not simply to believe that they do not exist or pretend that they do not exist. Also, I think it is not always advisable to simply try to avoid conflict at all costs. Okay, now I will slightly shift the debate, but it's still the same debate, to bring in perhaps a larger scope or another thing that is very much part of this interspace, namely first the question of enjoyment in this infamous jouissance plus de jouir that Lacan talks about, and also its possible, impossible delimitation and regulation. We may have the impression, and this is quite interesting, that, for instance, in contrast to the past and to some more or less fundamental religious traditions, particularly Christian, we are done with considering enjoyment as something evil. But I think this impression could not be more wrong. There are more and more forms of enjoyment which were considered rather innocent not so long ago that now really tend to strike us as intrinsically evil, not only unadmissible, but kind of they are surcharged with this evil connotation. We can take like a rather innocent or obvious example of enjoyment in jokes. Evil connotation related to enjoyment in jokes comes, for example, from the fact that it seems kind of ugly, evil to take pleasure, that is to enjoy at another person's expense or at the expense of the butt of the joke, their whatever supposed deficiency, misfortune, exposure, and so on. And of course, there are people who object to jokes and joking in principle, because the more hilarious the joke, the more hurtful usually, or at least in some intention, it is to its butt. And according to this argument, the enjoyment experienced here, making fun of other people and so on, is bad and ugly thing, and one should avoid it as a matter of principle. So this is not to say necessarily that if we want to be politically correct in this respect, no jokes are allowed. They are, but only like innocent jokes, so-called. For instance, the jokes about like abstract jokes, the jokes about, for instance, geometrical shapes. But if we look up at some of these, it becomes rather obvious that they do not so much resolve the problem as they kind of perpetuate it on their own ground. Okay, I just look up two of these jokes to kind of present you with an example. Two examples. So this is the first one. What did the triangle say to the circle? Your life seems so pointless. Okay, and then the other one. What did the hypotenuse say to the other side? Nice legs. Okay, you have it. Aggressiveness, sexism. These were the very two tendencies that Freud recognized at the very heart of all tendencies. This is non-innocent jokes. So even though these remarks do not refer, in this case, to any particular person or group or nationality or whatever, it is clear that the offensive reference is already implicit also within the abstract jokes. The enjoyment in aggressive and sexual remark is still there, making these jokes like less innocent than one might want them to be. But of course, to be sure, this problem with kind of clearly delimiting innocent jokes is the problem, I think, of enjoyment as such. Enjoyment is somehow always kind of structurally enjoyment at someone's expense, even when it doesn't seem so at first sight. I don't know, consider the classical example of someone driven crazy by the smell of the neighbor's cooking, possibly a meal belonging to another ethnic tradition. They cook, eat, and enjoy in the privacy of their kitchen, but since their enjoyment has a smell that kind of penetrates other apartments, they enjoy at their neighbor's expense. This is how this can be perceived. Or take the example of passive smoking. The more one wants to confine smokers to their own clearly delimited space, the more the smoke of their enjoyment has the tendency to find some way out and annoy us. So in this sense, I claim that to enjoy is to trespass. Not because of some excessive debauchery or radical transgression involved in it, but kind of structurally, because it is situated at the very intersection of the subject and the other. This is it, the only place where it kind of actually appears. It is the very name or concept of that what it comes up in this intersection. So socially, in this way, enjoyment registers as a form of trespassing, as crossing a limit which in itself is not entirely clear and is difficult to determine, and which we usually only decide as a limit or not in retrospect, once it has already been crossed or not. And of course, this is also how jokes function. I mean, joke is not a joke until it is told and somebody responds to it with laughter. This is also what Freud says. It's not that there is a joke and then the joke as such is not fully ontologically constituted before we laugh at it, before we kind of baptize it as a joke, that this has passed and that this limit was not crossed in this sense, but actually kind of possibly even united us in sharing this joke or in partaking in this particular form of enjoyment. So this is all to say that the structural problem of enjoyment is, I think, real. We cannot simply sweep it under the carpet or under the banners of tolerance. Enjoyment, the moment it manifests itself as enjoyment, is always kind of out of place, because precisely it has no place. There are, of course, symbolic spaces when it could be assigned, but there it is already precisely, we don't perceive it as this kind of intrusive things that disturbs us. It only exists, as I said, in this intersection of the subject and the other. It doesn't have a room of its own, to paraphrase the famous title. It is more like perhaps a corridor that both separates and connects different rooms. So I said to enjoy is to trespass, but I could also say to desire is to trespass, as well as to love is to trespass, an example that Slavoj often makes. Or even, why not even go so far as to say to speak is to trespass in this sense precisely, because one cannot simply separate speech from what gets attached to it in this dirty way. But if I dwell a little bit on this to love is to trespass, to focus a little bit on the question of love here, this brings us to, I think, very important, very also at this particular time, very actual thing that observations that Lacan makes in Ethics of Psychoanalysis in relationship precisely to the difference between love and philanthropy. He comments there quite extensively on this kind of a horror that seizes Freud at the Christian commandment of love of one's neighbor, this the Nächste, this du shall love thy neighbor as thyself. And as you probably know, Freud has this in Civilization and its contents, he has this kind of a reaction to this, but listen, man tries to satisfy, this is literally from Freud, man tries to satisfy his need for aggression at the expense of his neighbor, to exploit his work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to appropriate his goods, to humiliate him, to inflict suffering on him, to torture and kill him. So why should I love him indiscriminately? Something like this is the, and Lacan kind of is amused at this, what he recognizes a kind of a Aristotelian reaction in Freud, and comments on it in extenso, saying precisely that Freud's horror comes, among other things, from the fact that he takes love here not as a kind of, in a kind of philanthropic sense. We could also say that he doesn't take it in the common sense of what we call Christian love, as a kind of good that can be spread across and divided among the entire humanity. but precisely as something less benign and more demanding, more trespassing, if you want, in this way. So I will now read you what I think it's a little bit longer quote by Lacan, but it is really, I think it's quite powerful quote that brings us also directly to the heart of these issues. He says, "It is in the nature of the good to be altruistic, but that is not the love of thy neighbor." Freud makes us feel this without articulating it fully. Every time he stops short in horror at the consequences of the commandment to love one's neighbor, we see evoked the presence of that fundamental evil which dwells within this neighbor. But if this is the case, then it also dwells within me. And what is more of a neighbor to me than this heart within which is that of my jouissance, and which I don't dare go near. For as soon as I go near it, there rises up the unfathomable aggressivity from which I flee, that I turn against me, and which, in the very place of the vanished law, adds its weight to that which prevents me from crossing a certain frontier at the limit of the thing. Still a little bit, he goes on, as long as the question of the good, there is no problem. Our own and our neighbors are of the same material. San Martin shares his cloak. This refers to the biblical story. San Martin shares his cloak, and a great deal is made of it. Yes, it is after all a simple question of training. Material is by the very nature made to be disposed of. It belongs to the other as much as it belongs to me. But perhaps over and about the need to be clothed, he, San Martin, was begging for something else. The beggar, was begging San Martin for something else, namely then that San Martin either kill him or sleep with him. In any encounter, there is a big difference in meaning between response of philanthropy and that of love. I think this quote, and you will see where all this is heading, is quite important because it kind of efficiently draws our attention to an important difference between precisely what Lacan calls this kind of altruism, and he kind of really repeats this insistingly, how egoism and altruism are not at all incompatible. And I think this is also a very important lesson of our time, when we often tend to introduce or simply stop our social criticism in these terms of egoism. Oh, these are all about these egoistic drives. People are egoistic. They don't want to share, and so on. I think what Lacan is here trying to say is that it is altruism and egoism actually are kind of mirroring each other. They are not at all incompatible. What is incompatible with this logic is actually something else. So he says, for example, that my egoism is quite content with certain altruism, and it is a fact of experience that what I want is the good of others, but in the image of my own. And this really doesn't cost so much. What I want is the good of others, perceived, provided that it remain in the image of my own. So actually the argument and what kind of sticks out of it or doesn't fit this picture is precisely what he calls this evocation of jouissance, where all of a sudden my jouissance and that of the neighbor become indistinguishable, and hence all the more reason for this incompatibility, aggression. There is no place for both of us here. So the argument that Lacan makes is kind of moves in two steps or 2 points. The first would be this general that has already been made by Badiou in his book on St. Paul, I think, or perhaps on ethics, when he says that in all this proliferation of differences which we tend to glorify, we do this so far as none of these differences really makes a real difference. The moment there is some kind of a real difference, we are horrified by barbaric customs or whatever. We just stop at it. This kind of more sustained difference immediately directly translates into evil, a fundamental evil that dwells within this neighbor. We like others if they are but colorfully different versions of ourselves. And is it even desirable that they're a bit different? Uniformity and uniform repetition is already disturbing here. Why? Because it comes dangerously close to suggesting precisely what Lacan's second step suggests, namely that this evil that dwells within my neighbor also dwells within me, and it is actually one and the same evil. What is more of a neighbor to me than this heart, than my own jouissance, which I don't dare to go near? So in this sense, we could say the fundamental problem of jouissance is not simply that of difference, but even more, on an even more fundamental level, precisely that of sameness. The evil enjoyment of the other is the same as mine. But what does this mean? I claim that this does not mean that one cannot simply translate this in these kind of direct psychological terms and say that I secretly want to do what others do, even if I don't allow myself to do it. Although clearly repression in this kind of Freudian sense has the effect of replacing desire for something with hatred and repulsion for it. And by the way, when this happens, repulsion is real, it is not feigned. To say, for example, that, I don't know, most gay haters have themselves homosexual desires may be true, but these desires are not hidden somewhere behind or below the hatred and repulsion. They exist precisely as this repulsion. This is the way, the very passion in which it exists. It's not something to be, so it is, this repulsion is not simply faked, it is quite real. But this is more on the side. I just want to say that this sameness of the enjoyment, this is at least how I read it, does not refer to this kind of a same content of enjoyment, but precisely to something else, namely that before or below or besides any concrete forms enjoyment can take in terms of what gives me or you enjoyment, it is precisely this structural place, this emptiness also. Lacan says, a hollowed out space which emerges and exists precisely as the intersection between the subject and the other. Of course, present also in the configuration of the intersubjectivity. It is repeated with every one of us. Yes, it is the same space. There is a question of individuation, if you want, at stake here. It is a kind of indivisible space or emptiness that only becomes divisible, that is to say, precisely ready for segregation, when particular forms of enjoyment emerge to it, and they always do, related to different practices, cultures, subjectivities, and so on. But at the heart, it's the same problem, it's the same thing that one doesn't particularly want to deal with that emerges. But segregating different forms of enjoyment does not, I think, resolve the problem, which is precisely that of the sameness. The moment that enjoyment comes or seems to come too close, even within our reach, we usually don't simply embrace it, but raise all kinds of defenses against it. This is also one of Lacan's claim in the Ethics. And I think we can perhaps relate this to an interesting question also of today's actuality, namely the question of hate speech. Do people who practice it enjoy it? I think this is a real question. I believe enjoyment perhaps constitutes a marginal gain in the practice of hate speech. It is much more on the side perhaps of the defense against enjoyment. To use hate speech, it's perhaps not so much to enjoy the dirty words aimed at the other, as it is to insult, to curse the enjoyment as such, perceived precisely as situated in the other. But that perhaps we should take this dimension into account as well, that it is also, hate speech is also a practice of slurring this difficult, extimate, problematic place of enjoyment. Okay, we have, I don't want to go on for too long, so I will simply now kind of wrap up by trying to answer some direct questions that probably have arisen in relationship to what I've been saying. First of all, does what I've been saying mean that the problem at stake here is fundamentally a psychological problem? No. This is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that, for instance, it follows from there that we simply need to come to terms with our enjoyment and all our whatever social and political problems will be solved. No, it is a structural problem, and psychology is already a response to this structural problem. We could say that human psychology is a response to a certain impasse of contradiction of symbolic order, which exists in different configurations. It is a structural problem which does not exist independently of our interaction with others, and above all, which does not exist independently of the social bonds and edifices that we partake in. And when Freud wrote Civilization and its Discontents, this has already been about him detecting precisely two things: a kind of increase in, as we would put it today, mental issues like psychological problems, and about their intrinsic, irreducible link to the social, to the civilization. Civilization is not simply the cause of this, but these issues are, it's kind of its inherent symptom. And I think it's safe to say that the discomfort in civilization is even growing or exploding nowadays. And this is not simply because, okay, there are different kind of crises. It is not simply because for many, let's say, it's really hard and insecure, which it certainly is, but also because on top of this, we are supposed to be kind of entirely responsible for it and to deal with it personally. You know, this is the usual, whatever, ideological answer. The whole job market is extremely precarious, where you should be able to deal with it. And if you are not, okay, invest in some psychological growth or therapy, or if you cannot afford it, medication. And the statistics about the rise in the amount of antidepressive and, anti-anxiety drugs is really stunning. So I said that psychology is a kind of response to a structural problem of the symbolic order, and the expanding of psychology shows in this respect, I think, a really huge failure precisely of social politics to somehow also address this structural problem or to articulate this in different ways. I think it is not psychoanalysis, but the official ideology of late liberal capitalism that constitutes a proper machine for turning social problems into psychological problems with us to deal with them. So I think what happens more and more, particularly, we can say in Western society, is that our psychology kind of remains as the almost only social infrastructure. The rest of this infrastructure being precisely successfully destroyed by the ideology and practice of this kind of neoliberal capitalism. It is upon the weight that our psychology is supposed to carry here, it's quite amazing. And I was reminded when I was writing about this, of course, this famous saying by Margaret Thatcher, society does not exist, or there is no such thing as society, and then I looked into the whole interview where she actually said this, and it's really quite amazing. And I cannot go into all details, but it is really amazing because it is all precisely about this question of whether there are only individuals, of course, and then this frictional interspace, or there is some kind of a social infrastructure that can take upon itself precisely certain things that are now expected only from us to take upon. And what is really interesting is that it is precisely the question of the neighbor that pops up in this interview. In this way, she articulates this famous saying. So I will simply read to you a slightly longer section that surrounds the famous quote about there being no society. She says, so this is 1987, I think we have gone through a period, this was the period of the welfare state, of course, we have gone through the period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government job to cope with it. And so they are casting their problems upon society, but who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look for themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves first, and then after our neighbor. Again, there is no such thing as society. So, okay, first ourselves and then our neighbor. This is not a very Christian thing to say, but I'm not even pointing out this question of the whatever egoism, altruism. It is more about the next line where she kind of illustrates how this welfare state social benefits are actually abused by those who manipulate the system. And here you see this figure of the neighbor emerge in its kind of with all the evils, so to say, that Lacan points out. She says, if you cannot get a job, you should have a basic standard of living. This was the idea behind the DOE. But what then some people come and say, but what then is the point of working? I can get as much on the dole. And then the answer, look, it is not from the dole, it is your neighbor who is supplying. You see, the whole emergence, how precisely the infrastructure that was there precisely in order for, let's say, very bluntly, this money not coming directly from my neighbor, but from something which exists as a social infrastructure and institution, is now say there is this nominalist argument, okay, but there is no society. Who can see society? Like, we can see individual horses, but who can see a horse as such walking around? So there is no such thing. So it is directly your neighbor. And I think you can actually very much point down here the very idea or the very re-emergence of your neighbor as those on dole, so to say, evil neighbors, because they kind of directly take money from yourself, so good, honest work and so on. So I think basically the argument that I would like to make is that perhaps, yeah, those even in power, or progressive forces in power, who very much often tend or worry about our feelings, about our psychological comfort, to them that we should perhaps say, forget about our feelings and about protecting them and start doing your job of making kind of social life depend less on less shaky ground than precisely on this kind of feelings and emotional responses. But instead, I think what we see is mostly, on the one hand, the encouragement and valorization of affects on the one side, and a segregation as the only regulation or only response to the growing hostility and friction on the other side. The less we come in touch with those who not only live and think differently, but actually share the same space also, we can put it like this, of surplus enjoyment, of surplus value, the better. And I've given this example in the class, which I think is quite eloquent of all the impotence of how institutions tend to deal with this kind of frictions. I allegedly it really happened in one American university when they were female students sunbathing, I mean, sitting outside on the lane in kind of short sleeve t-shirts, and there were like Mexican workers working on the facade of the building just next to this field, and they started like throwing some remarks at girls, kind of sexual remarks, I suppose. So there was a complaint from the female students about this sexual harassment. So the solution that the university came up with was the following. They actually enveloped the whole building where the workers were working on with another wall. So they kind of boxed it in. They put another facade, let's say, on the outside, and then they built a corridor leading from there, from this working place to outside the campus, so that these two groups would never come into any contact. And I think this is precisely, I think it's a kind of image of precisely how the only way that we have found so far of dealing with these issues, which are of course profoundly also political, economic, and so on, is simply this kind of segregation, even on this micro level. We just have these separate spaces. And so I would simply say that this can bring us back to the question of this interspace that I was talking about earlier. I said that this was a kind of, that this interspace is crucial space out of which also our social ties and configurations are generated, are determined. And it is also, the place of the possible conflict. But that closing this space also by ways of simply segregation is a very dangerous game, which has kind of serious consequences. Because I think by closing up this space, we also are closing up the very space of politics proper, not only of whatever social interaction, because this space is precisely where eventually some tectonic shifts can happen, and where, as I tried to argue at the beginning, causality gets decided, or what it gets decided is to what extent something, at least to some extent, something will determine us, and what will determine us, and what will not determine us on this kind of decisive fundamental level. Okay, sorry if this was a little bit confused, but yeah, this is it.